Michael, we are ready to go.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this special timely event to discuss the significance and implications of recent economic reforms in Cuba. The Cuban economy is in dire condition, hit hard by the collapse of the Venezuelan economy, a drop in tourism and remittances, U.S. sanctions, and of course, the effects of COVID-19. The economy tracked by some 11% in 2020. Out of pragmatism, or some say desperation, in January, the government pursued a monetary reform that puts an end to the dual currency, which has long been on the agenda and discussed widely about Cuba. And early last month, the government announced that it planned to expand the number of sectors open to private business. For some observers, these recent developments suggest that Cuba's economic reform process, which had been paralyzed since 2016, is gaining new momentum. Will these measures be able to stem Cuba's economic decline? To what degree will they help? To what degree will they help? As we know, key sectors of the economy remain off limits. Of course, these changes are taking place in a wider context of increased dissident protests against political repression and censorship, and a recent video, Patria y Vida, that went viral, as well as a new administration in Washington that is currently reviewing its policy options regarding Cuba. So this is a very, very timely event, and we're extremely fortunate to have three outstanding speakers with us who have agreed to share their insights and perspectives on the current situation and where things seem to be heading in Cuba. I'll introduce them very briefly, but you could see their very impressive bios on our website. I'll introduce them in the order in which we'll have the conversation. Pablo Vidal Alejandro is now a professor of economics at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana of Cali, in Cali, Colombia, and we welcome him. Ted Henkin is associate professor of Department of Sociology at Baruch College at the City University of New York, and it's great to have Ted with us again. And finally, Vicki Huddleston is a retired U.S. ambassador and former chief of the U.S. intersection in Havana, and we're delighted to have Vicki with us. We've had her in previous events, and it's great to have her with us again. Our format today is that I will have a brief conversation with each of the speakers, trying to cover the main issues. And after that, we will open it up for your questions and comments and look forward to what I know will be a very fruitful exchange. Participants could submit questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom, on Twitter using our hashtag U.S Cuba Future, or by emailing meetings@thedialogue.org. Before turning to Pavel, I want to give special thanks to Lenier Gonzalez, now a visiting research associate at the Dialogue and formerly with Cuba Posible. Lenier did a great job reaching out to the speakers and organizing the event. Let me also thank Gaston Ocampo, my Dialogue colleague, for his assistance and support. So to start the conversation, let me turn to Pavel first. And Pavel, I guess the first question I'd like to ask you is, for all of the factors that I cited about how hard the Cuban economy has been hit recently, how has it still managed to survive?
Okay, thank you, Lenier and Michael, for this invitation. Okay, first, you already described this grave crisis that the Cuban economy is facing. I'm going to go into some details on how this is going to express in some uneven impact by sectors and how this is going to be solved by the Cuban government, what are the reforms that they are planning to put in place besides the exchange rate adjustment. No? But first, I would like to say that we better not again underestimate the Cuban government capacity to deal with this crisis. Where they have like a PhD working in this situation. The Cuban system has proved to be dysfunctional unless we have some external partners that are ready to trade in some preference terms, namely Soviet Union and more recently Venezuela. But I think that they know how to handle this situation. I once wrote in Cuba Posible saying that in this extreme crisis they know how to avoid collapse as good, and they are very good at it, as good as they are avoiding economic progress in normal times. So that's the situation of the Cuban economy over the last 3 decades. We've been in what we call a secular stagnation. This situation is really grave when you compare some macroeconomic indicators. When you see the news that are coming out from Cuba, we cannot avoid to compare this economic landscape with the economic crisis in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Actually, the decline of the GDP that you just mentioned is similar to what we had in 1991. And if we check out, for example, the expected dynamic for the inflation rate, the size of the fiscal deficit, and the situation of the balance of payments, there are many similarities with the situation in the early 90s. That being said, I think that this crisis has different causes and will need different solutions.
Great, thank you. Why don't we, if you could give us your sense of what's happening now in terms of the exchange rate issue. Why is that important? Will it make a difference? And also, if you can comment on the more sectors being open to private business. What is that enough, or is it a first step but not enough? How do you see these recent changes?
I think that this is taking place in a difficult time, as we just mentioned. Cuba doesn't have the aid or any from IMF or any other international financial institution to soften these blows. I mean, this is an accumulation of different shocks. The Venezuelan shock, the escalation of the U.S. sanctions. Then we have the pandemic. Maybe it's questionable, but the Cuban government decided to go ahead with this meaningful exchange rate adjustment, maybe in the worst time. But I think that the idea to go ahead with this exchange rate adjustment is because they know that they need this they need to bring some normalcy to our monetary system if we want to go ahead with other reform. I think that this exchange rate reform is like preparing the ground for more structural reforms. In the first place, this is going to bring more transparency. We will understand what are the sectors and companies, especially state-owned enterprises, that are really competitive and which ones are not viable. That's something that this is a pending adjustment that we've been postponing since the early 90s, and we've been keeping subsidizing these zombie state enterprises for too long. This is an important source of wasted resources and energy that before we didn't know exactly how much was the subsidy that we were using to keep these not viable state-owned enterprises afloat. Now we have a better sense on how much it costs. Now we can check the state budget and we can see how many billions we are using, Cuban pesos, billions we are using to subsidize these enterprises. So I think this is an opportunity, and this is going to bring more transparency to force the Cuban government to restructure the state sector. At the same time, they need to balance, to counterbalance this eventual restructure of the state sector with a new opening to private enterprises. And we know that these are reforms that are already announced, and we are looking forward to see the extent and the execution of these new reforms that are needed to complement the exchange rate adjustment.
Thank you. What is your sense, sort of knowing the Cuban economy so well and your knowledge of Cuba, about what is likely to be the sort of the pace and the scale of these structural reforms? You know, how far will they go, and will it just be very, very slow, or will we see a dramatic change? Or what is your sense of how that's likely to unfold?
I think it's part of the political economy. We need to see what is going to happen in the coming Congress of the Communist Party. And we have to see how much support the Communist Party Congress is going to endorse to these upcoming reforms. I think that we have an accumulation of many distortions, but I think that the exchange rate reform could be like a tipping point. I think this is like forcing all these inefficiencies out. We know now we know the better the cost of continuing postponing the structural reforms. Now we know the cost of these or incompetent decisions that we made in the past. So I think that the exchange rate adjustment and the unification of national currencies is going to push for further reform. I mean, that's the only reason why the Cuban government decided to go ahead with this big bang devaluation, because this is creating a lot of financial distress in the economy. This is going to a very difficult shock to absorb for the economy. So you have to make the most of this decision. So that I will connect the need for a structural reform with this decision to go ahead with this big bang devaluation. But I mean, the data are there, the information that we need to understand better the dysfunctionality of the Cuban government is now more visible. So let's see how they are going to use this information.
What do you see, Pavel, in terms of foreign investment in Cuba? What are the prospects given these changes and moving in this direction? What are we likely to see in terms of foreign investment?
I think for the foreign investment, for potential foreign investor, this is a good news. From now on, they will land in an economy that at least is operating with a single national currency and with a single official exchange rate. In that case, is easier to calculate, to estimate the return of the investment projects, and it's more easy. It's easier to understand the financial risk that they are going to take. But for the foreign investment that are already in Cuba, this is going to being a difficult shock. They are dealing with this relative price shock. We know that in the history of fixed exchange rate systems, we always accumulated many distortions, and when we decide to move the exchange rate, we are realizing some losses. So I think that the foreign investment in Cuba is trying to navigate this difficult shock after this exchange rate adjustment. But I think in the future, this is going to be a positive net for the economy. And one important positive implication for the foreign investment is that after the devaluation of the Cuban peso, the labor costs are lower in Cuba. They can pay higher salaries in Cuban peso using less dollar. And this mechanism through the government employment agencies is still in place, but because we no longer have two exchange rates, these agencies can no longer appropriate of a proportion of salary, and I think that's a good news for the labor market that they are going to face in Cuba.
Mhm. Final question, and then I'm sure we'll come back to you with other questions. But do you find it useful to talk about, as many analysts do, about a model that Cuba is moving towards, like the Vietnam model or other models? Is what are we? Is this going to resemble anything that we've seen before?
I think that in the era of the Raúl Castro reforms, I saw many similarities with Vietnam, and now I think that they know that the importance of opening up the economy for small and medium enterprises, because when you check the reaction or the response of the economy, former Soviet economy, after this big bang devaluation, we can see that the Vietnam economy responded in a much better way, and that's because the structure of the Vietnam economy was based in family businesses, self-employment, and small and medium enterprises. And we know that these kind of economic units are very important to make the most of a new change in the monetary system, something that is different from what happened in the Eastern Europe, in which the exchange rate devaluation produced like more like a collapse in most industries. So I think it's important to use that lesson from Vietnam, and economists, my fellow economists are trying to say that it's still important to see what Vietnam did during the Doi Moi and after that.
Great, terrific. That was great. I'm sure we'll come back to you. There'll be a lot of questions, and so hang on. But that was a terrific opening. Let me turn to Ted now. And Ted, you've really tracked so closely this sort of private sector businesses in Cuba, and I just wonder if you can give us your assessment of, sort of do a deeper dive in terms of what this actually means, these reform, and how far it goes, and obviously there are some sectors that are still off limits, other sectors are now would be open to private business. How do you see this change?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's good to be back, at least virtually in Washington, D.C., and certainly to share the screen with my illustrious colleagues here, and with your almost 200 participants. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you called it a sort of private sector. And I think that's key to remember. The Cuban government still doesn't talk about el sector privado. It is still using the euphemism trabajo por cuenta propia, self-employment. And the other big thing that has still been scheduled for 2021 is a small and medium-sized enterprise sector with regulations and legal personality. And we don't have that yet. So when you see headlines that talk about private businesses or private enterprises in Cuba, it's still the case that they don't exist legally. What exists are many of these businesses that wear a mask, which is the self-employment mask, and then there are actually people who are self-employed, mostly in the services sector, very limited. And so the big news, the headline that I would write if I were talking about what is interesting, important, even unprecedented, is that Cuba went from a situation where the government told you what you could do to now the government telling you what you can't do. And that's an important philosophical frame of reference. Oniel Diaz Castellanos has even called it a change of paradigm. I would say that that's true. It's a change of paradigm when you talk about the specific rules governing self-employment, but I wouldn't yet call it a change of paradigm when you talk about the private sector or small and medium-sized business. That's still to be determined. And unfortunately, the government is moving, I think, too slowly. It took them 6 months from when they announced this change to implementing this significant elimination of the old list of things you could do and introduction of a new list of things you can't do. The government also was really bad at its own PR. On the 6th of February, it announced that it was going to do this elimination of the old list. And then everybody, of course, was waiting to find out what was on the new list. And it was like a bucket of cold water that the government poured over its own announcement. When it announced this new list of things that were prohibited, virtually it was every imaginable profession, everything that would include people with university degrees or special skills. The government is still going to monopolize, at least in the short term, until we hear about this small and medium-sized sector and the rules. It's going to still monopolize professions, right? But if you look at the good news is that potentially they went from a list of allowed occupations of 143, I think it was, to potentially more than 2,000. That could be unprecedented in terms of the kind of spread of a still service, still limited, but it could multiply and grow the private sector, which has gradually grown from about 150,000 up to over 600,000. And it could potentially double or triple if really the Cuban government allows people to be innovative and creative. There's a saying in Spanish that I think captures the moment well, which is, entre lo dicho y lo hecho hay un gran trecho. Between what is said and what is done, there's a great chasm, right? And the good news is that the government said what it was going to do in July, and actually over the past 6 months have done 3 or 4 of those things. And these are things that the government said it was going to do many times over the last 10 or 15 years, and was either too afraid or unable for various reasons or unwilling to do those. Unfortunately, it took the combination of Donald Trump's return to a hard embargo, Venezuela crisis, and COVID-19 to push the government towards these. Why is that a bad news? Because as Pavel said, this is a worst possible time. Talk about bad timing, right? To institute these long delayed reforms. But the other reason that it's problematic is that it tells us that there may not really be a will in changing the script and changing structural way that the government or the economy works. It may be the government has been forced to do this, I think, as you said in the introduction. And so that may lead us with a situation of, how real is this? Is it just a conjunctural strategy to get through another crisis, and then they'll reverse things as they have done many times before? Or is this something that we can believe and change that Cubans can believe in, especially Cuban entrepreneurs?
Great, thanks. So your sense of the impact, the likely impact and effect on the Cuban economy is not really clear. I mean, it's these changes are unlikely to really significantly affect the current dire state of the economy.
I think that it's good news and it's moving in the right direction. The problem is that until we really see how it's implemented, the devil of the details, and until we see it accompanied by regulations that, una ley de empresas, a law that would govern private enterprise and private businesses, that would allow the formation of these with limited liability. Right now, it's really the owner and the license holder takes all the risk, bears all the risk in his or her own name. And so until we see that, and I'm hoping it comes before 2022, which is when it's scheduled to happen. You asked Pavel again about the scheduling, about the sequencing, and about how fast this will happen. And the government moves slow, I think, because this is very complex, but it also moves slow because it's very risky in terms of the government losing its ability to control the change that it knows it needs to make. And I think that's why they're going slow. However, Cuba continues to bleed its talent to immigration, right? It's afraid of giving people rights to do these things within Cuba because it means power sharing, it means a different economic and political dynamic. But it also, the slower they go, the more people are going to give up and leave the country. That's why it's really important to look at that professional sector. After this was announced, the government did make some changes. The government is listening, which is a really positive thing, and it's changing things as it rolls things out based on feedback. For a long time, it was virtually deaf to the entrepreneurial sector itself and to the people who are active in it. But over the last couple of years, you've seen a shift and them adjusting as they move based on feedback. How many of the professions that are on that list of 147 that are banned will end up becoming allowed over the next year before we get to the small and medium-sized sector law or regulations? That's an important thing to look at. Of course, no one really expected health, education, security, or unfortunately, private press, newspapers, magazines, book publishing. All of that is banned, and I don't think anyone really expected those to be legalized. But what about engineers? What about architects, right? Why not all veterinarians instead of just veterinarians for pets, right? I call it the vet pets, or the pet vets rule, right? And so the government has a tendency to get extremely specific, almost humorously specific about these things, when that kind of oversight can lead to a lot of discretion among bureaucrats and corruption. They did try to streamline this by setting up what they call una ventanilla única, one stop setting up your business. And they also said that your business should be approved automatically as long as you check off all the boxes of being able to do it, meaning that they're not going to give the bureaucrats, supposedly, we'll see how it works out, much discretion in being able to deny or try to maybe extort the entrepreneurs in Cuba. That's a good sign as well. But I would say that because there have been 2 steps forward, 1 step back in these reforms over the last 10 years, we should also expect that. And also, clearly, the 3 factors I mentioned before have forced the government's hand, or it has empowered the reformists within the government to get their way, or to and the economists and the entrepreneurs that have been making these recommendations are getting a hearing. Pedro Monreal, for example, is he's been making these arguments about small and medium-sized enterprises and how these things might be rolled out and implemented, and it looks like there is some listening going on, but we had to remember that there are hardliners who want anything but this opening, and they may win the day in the short or longer term, and we don't know.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you, I'm sure. Let's turn now to Vicky. And Vicky, you're listening to these 2 expositions. I was wondering, how should the Biden administration be understanding and looking at these changes with all their limitations that I think both Pavel and Ted have been very, very clear about? But what does this mean for a new approach of the administration towards Cuba?
Thank you, Michael. What a pleasure to be on. I'm delighted to be here with you and back again, and with 2 such knowledgeable and informed professors as Ted and Pavel. I've learned so much just listening to you right now. Well, I was thinking I was going to comment on some of the things they said, which I
Sure,
will.
that's fine.
Since you asked the question, I'm going to take it on right up front. I was thinking, okay, I'll be a good panelist, and I won't take that on right up front.
Okay.
But since you asked, I think the Biden administration has an opportunity to put the Cuban people first, not the conservative Cuban American people first. And that it also has an opportunity to change the strategic lineup of Cuba, which is closer and closer, like with Iran, with Soberania, the new vaccine, Russia and China. It also has an opportunity to stop this tragic migration. We just saw that a boat of people was picked up with 2 pregnant women. It's very lucky our Coast Guard was there. And it also gives us a chance to have a new relationship. But if I were advising the Biden administration, which clearly I'm not, I would say move now to do the things you can do. And that, of course, is more flights, higher levels of remittances, cooperate on COVID, especially in developing countries, provide humanitarian relief where needed, and return to all of the bilateral commissions. I disagree with the Biden's Cuban review prior to setting out a new executive rules that would return essentially the embargo to the time of Obama and Biden. So, for example, I would like to see them begin rewriting the rules, and maybe they are while they're doing the review. I hope so, on trade, investment, and travel to Cuba, as well as begin the process for removing Cuba from the terrorist list. The terrorist list, I think, is really important because it's symbolic. You know, how can we be friends with a country that's on the terrorist list? That means they're doing bad things to ourselves in the world. And it's facetious, it degrades the list, and that we should be working on that right now rather than, you know, reviewing Cuban policy. I think the Cuba policy review is critical for removing the sanctions, for getting Congress to pass a law that completely wipes out the sanctions. You know, 60-year plus, it's more than overdue. Pavel began by saying, yes, the Cuban government knows how to survive. And we, of course, saw this as in the special period. And they have survived. You know, the Cuban people have been hurt enormously, as you say, Michael, with the 11% decrease in their GDP. But, you know, it doesn't change the government. Maybe it pushes, as Ted said, the government more toward reform, and we're very happy to see that. But since Cuba has moved toward these reforms that Ted and Pavel have pointed out, uniting the currency, which is extremely difficult, was put off for years, opening up businesses, then the United States should move forward on these things I've mentioned to reinforce that. I was so struck with Pavel saying that maybe this is the tipping point that Cuba has reached because it's more transparent and you can see what the budget looks like. And then Ted said, this is a paradigm shift. Yeah, that's amazing. I hadn't really thought about this being a paradigm shift, but I think in essence that is what we're talking about. And we shouldn't just let Russia and China and Iran come to the aid at a difficult time. We should be helping the Cuban people. And I love this comment you made, Tim, about it's no longer the Cuban government saying what people can do, rather what they can't do. That is an enormous change. So very quickly, I think I threw all those things in there, Michael.
Okay, great. What is your view about the? I think that one of the debates that I see going on here is this. You know, should there be a quid pro? Should we go back to quid pro quoism?
I hate it. I mean, you know, there's always something Cuba's doing. Right now, they're oppressing the artist.
Right.
You know,
right.
They shouldn't be doing this. They have
right.
human rights activists back in jail. That's bad. These are terrible things. But, we have to sanction them, or we're not going to change our policy until these people are out of jail. It doesn't help a bit. What we really saw with Obama was that by beginning, the process of opening up, they did let 75 human rights activists out of jail. I would argue that human rights activists who I worked with a lot, and some now don't agree with me, of course, are better off every time we have better relations, because then Cuba has no excuse for clamping down on dissent.
Did you expect the Cuban government to do more? Or what were your expectations with the Obama rapprochement? Did you, in terms of the response of the Cuban government, was there an opportunity lost, or did you think that this was what happened was simply what was predictable?
Well, yes, I agree. It was predictable. And, now the Biden administration said we should have gone farther with Cuban Americans. Maybe, I don't know. Because there are some Cuban Americans who are really great and could do so much for Cuba. On the other hand, if they got more conservative Cuban Americans in, they might have gone less far. The Cuban government didn't respond as well as I would have hoped. They did talk to American businesses. They did improve on their human rights, but it was the transparency problem, to go back to Pavel.
Right.
How do you deal with this top-down heavy bureaucracy, which people are paid almost nothing for their services, and everybody's afraid to do anything unless, someone at the top says you can do it. And that's why it makes Ted's point so important, because now the Cuban government is saying what you can't do.
Right. Great. Thank you so much. We're going to now turn to questions from the audience. And I just want to remind you that you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by emailing meetings@thedialogue.org. Let me start. There have been a few questions. Maybe I'll ask two questions to Pavel to get us started. One is from Ileana Fuentes. And she asked about foreign investment, that Meliá is cutting down its investments and Bankia has withdrawn altogether. These are all reliable Spanish investors, and now they're withdrawing. How does this reflect on the future of foreign investments? And could you also address, there's a question still about Venezuela. I know that because of the collapsing economy, that Venezuelan money has really dropped. But is there any continuing economic support from Venezuela?
Well, I don't know about I don't have the specific about the Meliá decision. It could be a normal adjustment. We know that the tourism sector is the one that has been more hardly hit, and we know that the recovery is going to be very slow in this sector. As I heard, they are just making a business decision, but they are still operating in Cuba, and the stake are high for Meliá is still in Cuba. Bankia, I know that they've been piling up for over the last maybe 5 years millions of CUC. I think that's the Bankia decision is like one of the side effects of this monetary reform, that is saying that they don't have, or recognizing, materializing that the past losses, and they are saying that they cannot solve this situation. I mean, the Cuban government is falling behind on international payments since 2015. There was this agreement with the Paris Club, and we tried to reorder and to balance our international finance. We did some progress in that direction, but then the escalation of the U.S. sanctions and our own decision to put on hold on the reforms. I think that all that derivating in a situation, in a weakened macroeconomic situation, even before pandemic hit. So the Bankia decision is one of the consequences of how we manage the monetary policy that was behind the CUC after the de-dollarization in 2004 to 2005. Something that we have to learn. No? We have to try to know to backslide. We need to see what we did wrong with the CUC in terms of transparency, in terms of how to manage monetary and fiscal policy with less discretion, with more transparency, and with some limits to issue the national currency and trying to achieve some independence on autonomy of in the central bank from the state budget, something that I think that they are advancing with this new mechanism of public bonds, something that they have to improve a lot, but I think it's an important step. But I think that the Bankia decision has to do a lot of how we mismanage monetary policy after de-dollarization. And I think that we have many lessons to get from that, from those mistakes that we made since 2004 onward.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Pavel. Ted, let me ask you a couple of questions. One is from John Suarez, who asked what percentage of the Cuban and quote private sector is run by the military. And there's also a question about unions from Joan Hill. She asked, what role does trade unions play in assisting workers to engage in this expanded list of professions? Ted?
Sorry about that. I went to mute I have children who might be screaming in the background, so I went to mute, but now I'm off of mute.
Okay.
I wanted to say thank you for the questions. Some of the questioners I know, and I appreciate them being here and asking questions. So GAESA, the military, and what percentage, supposedly the private sector makes up, the private sector, which is a kind of a misnomer. Eliana actually in her question called it the nano business sector. I would call it a micro enterprise sector. And sometimes it's a small business sector passing as a micro or nano business sector. 13% is the size it takes up of the economy if you don't count agriculture. If you count agriculture, it gets up to 27 or so. What percentage of that is run by GAESA? Well, of the 13%, I would say almost none, because this is looking just at self-employment, or almost only at self-employment, trabajo por cuenta propia. However, there are clearly ways for people who have influence in, military generals, retired generals, to probably get an easy shake and a protected existence if they do start businesses. So I would imagine that there's a certain amount of that going on, although it's impossible to know how much. I don't know beyond that. In terms of unions, I would say that the question, I think it was Joan who was asking this question, and unions in Cuba are not representative of the interests of workers. They are conveyor belts that basically push out and enforce government rules, government guidelines, and government discipline. So they're not representative or independent. So I wouldn't imagine that the unions would be able to do much to open up, for example, legalize the professions. Or certain professions. I mean, there's a possibility that behind closed doors, there are some people who are trying to do that, but I wouldn't count on the unions to represent greater flexibility or freedom. There has been a number of spokespeople, kind of self-appointed, but still very eloquent and I think sensitive and dogged spokespeople who have kind of played a role as kind of middlemen and women between the private sector as it struggles to gain more space, as it makes repeated demands or suggestions to the government. I mentioned before Oniel Diaz Castellanos. There's also Marta Deus, and of course my good friend Camilo Condis. And I like to listen to them because they listen to other entrepreneurs and then make, either through Twitter or through various other publications, both online, and some of them are actually listened to by the government. I mean, Oniel, for example, has been very critical in the past of the slowness of the list that was abolished. And he was actually featured in a podcast put on by Cuba Debate. So there is some listening going on in terms of the discontents, the ideas, the suggestions, and the demands of the private sector for the government to pick up that and act on some of it. And I like to listen to them because they don't agree with each other, those people I mentioned. And so to find out what's happening, you have to kind of split the distance between a kind of more, let's say, optimistic spin that is about a paradigm shift, as Vicky kind of quoted me, who I was quoting Oniel, and also Camilo will say, this looks like a snow job. They're pulling the wool over our eyes. What is this new thing? So the truth is somewhere in between, and it's elusive. But you also have to look at what's being done with the foreknowledge of what's happened in the past. And what's happened in the past has been a zigzagging path where you have to measure between what's being said and what's being done and realize that they're not the same thing. I mean, we've read headlines for maybe 10 or 15 years about the opening towards the private sector in Cuba, and then there's a stall, there's a step backwards. And so just like, as Vicky was saying, just like we shouldn't subject our policy toward Cuba to the whims of the Cuban government, nor should we, on the other side, nor should we expect that what the Cuban government is saying it's going to do is what they're actually going to do. You have to really look at the details and look at the rollout.
Great, thank you. Vicky, two questions for you. One is by Nick Ramos, who asked about, you had mentioned that sort of opened the possibility if the Congress would consider lifting sanctions on Cuba, I guess the embargo, and he asked, would this essentially mean doing a runaround the Cuban exile community? That's certainly against this policy, and how politically viable is that given the current composition and the key players in the U.S. Congress? And if you could also maybe say a word, we got a question about from John Oswald, who asks, how do you see the U.S. collaborating with Cuba on COVID-19? What do you see as some of the possibilities on that issue?
Oh, thank you, Michael. I think I'll start with Don's because I don't have a long answer. I remember Ebola very well, and our military, which was really unusual, participated in providing succor to the people of West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. And we cooperated with the Cuban physicians who were in those countries. I thought that was just amazing, and I thought it underlined the Obama-Biden desire to cooperate with Cuba internationally where it was doing good things. So should the Biden administration at some point decide that to use the US military or use CDC or use the National Institutes of Health and actually get out in the field, participate in vaccinations, which of course will depend on their availability. I hope we do it with those Cuban physicians that are on the ground, who've already done a very brave job in a number of countries around the world. Now to the other issue about lifting sanctions. Well, during the Obama-Biden opening, and this is always true of the Cuban American and Cuban exile community in Florida, it wasn't, don't quote me on figures because I forget them, but it was like 60% of Miami-Dade, Florida population. You go look at the Florida International University studies on this. It was a slight majority agreed with Obama-Biden policies on this. But then Trump comes in. We have the Marco Rubio taking complete advantage, Senator Rubio, on the illnesses of the American diplomats. So instead of trying to really find out what they were, we just closed the whole thing down. And with that and the other restrictions of the Trump administration, the opinion of the Cuban American community begins to shift, and they go back to being less inclined to opening to Cuba. I believe that if the Biden administration goes ahead and puts the Cuban people first and not the Cuban American people first, because Florida's a vote-rich state for a president, but it doesn't really make any difference to the Biden administration because they're not going to get those conservative Cuban Americans. Just forget it. So go to Congress, and I think how it really will start. I mean, I'm like, just get rid of the whole thing. It'll start with more agricultural reforms to make sales of agricultural products easier. It will begin with making more travel easier, but that has to actually be a law. You can make it easier and open up categories, but tourism is prohibited by law. So you have to change that law. And so there will be probably incremental reforms by the Congress. But the best thing we could do, get rid of the whole thing, pass a law that says, all 5 laws that mandate the embargo are null and void, wipe the state slate clean, and begin by focusing on how we deal with the Cuban people. And then we can use our sanctions more specifically to target individuals in the Cuban government who may be doing things on the human rights side that we really have serious concerns with.
Great, thank you. See, there are a lot of questions coming in. Let me turn it back to Pavel. Although there's as you can see in the questions, there I think people are keeping their expectations of these changes pretty much pretty modest. I think my sense is that they've seen a lot of sort of moments of hopefulness that were eventually dashed. But Pavel, there's one question here on remittances that I think would be helpful if you can talk a lot about it. Is there any way to an alternative to FinCEMEX as the facilitating entity for remittances? Are there any other banking institutions that might be useful in these transfers? Why don't you start with that one, if you could?
No, the answer is very short. No, there is 8 commercial banks that can play a more important role in these operations, and we have last time I checked, the Cuban banking system, financial system had 15 non-financial institutions like CEMEX. So I think that the capacity is there. So any of them can take on this task.
Great, thanks. Let me follow up with another question, and this is on the unification of the currency, and it's asked by Christopher Jensen. It says that through his research contacts, there seem to be a series of effects that are not accounted for in the formal market. And how do you see the public prices increase plus unification affects, how it affects the informal market and exchange?
Yes, we are seeing since late last year that the exchange rate in the informal market has been depreciating. So that means that the Cuban government advanced in the unification of the official exchange rate, but there is still a gap between the official exchange rate that now is 24 Cuban pesos to the dollar with the new exchange rate in the informal market. I think that new gap has something to do with the monetary reform, of course. Maybe this exchange rate has some influence of any sort of overshooting effect because of the uncertainty. But I think that this new exchange rate in the informal market is more reflecting the dollar crunch of the economy. We have less remittances, and we know that the tourism revenue has been reduced to a trickle. So it's a matter of supply and demand. But as soon as the Cuban economy start to recover, I would expect a further correction of this exchange rate as it happened in the 90s. We have to remember that in the 90s, we had this gap between the official exchange rate and the parallel exchange rate, but with the proper structural reform, the austerity measures that we implemented at that time, we managed to a conversion between the parallel exchange rate and the official exchange rate. I know that some people have recommended the Cuban government to go ahead with a second devaluation of the official exchange rate, something that I strongly do not advise, because we assuming processes digesting this 24 devaluation is a lot, and I don't expecting any new correction in the official exchange rate by the time being.
Great. Thanks, Paolo. I'm going to turn to you for the final question too. One thing we haven't really talked about, which I think would be very helpful, is about the tourism industry. Sarah Berndt says that, and her impression is that before 2016, the Cuban government was banking on the tourism industry to prop up much of the economy's other losses. This would include both state enterprises and the cuenta propistas. How will the recent monetary changes impact that sector?
I think that this is going to increase the competitiveness of the tourism sector. All the tradable sector are the winners after an exchange rate devaluation, and tourism is not the exception. We will see that this sector will be facing a lower labor cost, and they will have the possibility to integrate more easily with the private sector, because now we have a big chunk of the economy operating with the same currency and with the same exchange rate. That being said, I think that one of the unfulfilled objectives of this monetary reform is the convertibility of the Cuban pesos. This is something very important that we should address once the pandemic is behind us, because that's together with the unification of the exchange rate and the currency, this is the main goal of the monetary reform on paper. No, I worked for the central bank for a few years, and I know that this was always the main goal to reestablish the convertibility of the Cuban peso, because that's the way that you provide a monetary system that enforce and facilitate transactions within the economy, because now we have a unified exchange rate and unified currency, but the dual scheme in the economy remained, because we still have some sectors that are operating in US dollars. So we are advancing together with the monetary adjustment. We are advancing in dollarization of the economy. There was a necessity in this pandemic, but I think this is going to be only a temporary situation. But the chance that we will have in the future to roll back this dollarization depends on our capacity to reestablish the convertibility of the Cuban peso. That would be the best situation for all sectors, including tourism.
Great, thank you, Pavel. And unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time. I'm sorry to those who asked questions and made comments that we just couldn't get to, but there's obviously a lot of issues and a lot of things to talk about, and we'll have to hold more events, and hope that we'll be able to continue to engage Pavel and Ted and Vicky. They have been really, we thank them very much for sharing their expertise and their knowledge and their perspectives on these critical issues and taking time out from their busy schedules to engage in this exchange. And I also want to thank all of the participants who tuned in and submitted questions. To learn more about future dialogue events, please visit thedialogue.org/events. And to thank all of our participants for joining us, and also give special final thanks again to Lanier Gonzalez for his help in making this event possible, and of course Gaston as well for his support. And most important of all, just please, all of you, take good care and stay well and stay healthy. Take care and thank you again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.